Okay, welcome back. I'm going to try to talk about chapters 5 and 6 in one video, but I been while reading I was thinking, I haven't really said anything about the elements of tragedy. I don't think so. So that's really crucial. And it gives you, the more you know about it, which, is to say, the more context you have about anything that you're reading, the better time you'll have trying to analyze without using plot. Okay, because that's ultimately for your essays, and not just AP, but really any essay is not about a summary. Otherwise, they would ask you for a summary. But the whole point of having a thesis and making a claim is that you are making some other kind of outside argument, and you're using the text to demonstrate that point. Okay, so this book doesn't fit perfectly with the tragic hero, even though it's very tragic. The tragic hero has certain elements that Jude really doesn't have in terms of the entire, if you look at it the whole as a whole. The mayor of Casterbridge that I had mentioned, Henchard, he works well because he is or becomes a mayor. It always seems to work better if the protagonist is either a king, like King Lear, or Macbeth, and why? Because they need to be at a great height to fall. It makes the fall that much greater. So with a tragic hero, even if they do something really bad, like kill somebody, you wouldn't say that they're a villain, because they start off basically a good person. There's something about them that makes them great in the first place. And what usually happens is they start acting on a tragic flaw. Okay, so I'm going to get into that more with chapter 6. But for chapter 5, just to pick up where I was last time, and looking at Jude's situation, he gets a hold of these classic books, and if you could imagine, this is pretty difficult to get through. And like I've said before, there's spark notes. There's other, like if you were to read a Shakespeare play, you could easily get No Fear Shakespeare. You would get like, this is what it means line by line. He's doing this all on his own, and I mean not just reading Greek, reading the New Testament in Greek, teaching himself that language that takes years and years of. For one thing, he lives in a town where nobody is educated really. So he, if you're trying to learn a foreign language, it works best if you can actually immerse yourself. Who does Jude even have to talk to? It's very lonely, which is another thing that I wanted to bring up in this lecture, and that is the archetype of the orphan. And he is an orphan, and he's stuck with his aunt, and I talked about that in the beginning. He calls his crusty aunt. So I just want to say that, Jude starts off pretty blameless. And if you look at the heroic cycle, it always typically starts off with somebody who is odd. He's an odd boy. He doesn't fit in with everybody else. And that's part of why he has to leave. And then in his case, he's thinking, if I go to Christminster, then I'm going to be around people like-minded, intellectuals, and it'll naturally raise my position. Okay, so that's kind of his dream, and the grass is greener on the other side vision. So he has that as an archetype: exile, is going to be necessary, because that's also part of the journey is to actually leave home. Like Luke Skywalker, for instance, leaves home, you know, and that's kind of the jumping off point where you're accepting that something else, you know, at first maybe you don't want to, but then you're going to have to get through the first threshold somehow. But for a tragic hero, if you really want a kind of a more explanation on how this works, I would watch my YouTube video on King Lear, and it's like 10 minutes, and all I try to do is get to the tragic elements, and King Lear works well because he's a king. So what's happening now in the book is you see the society. First it's the rejection of the parents, and now it's the society looking at him and saying, you know, the baker boy shouldn't be able to read while he's working. You know, so they're minding his business. And also, I think it's important to note, and these are just like little details you can use to analyze, is that they're picking on the poor boy doing something completely harmless. In fact, he's improving himself. They should be happy. Compared to someone who is wealthy, doing God knows what, and that's okay. So I think you could make a case for the discrimination of the social class too, is the baker's boy. He's supposed to be doing this, and really show Jude as being the burden, even though he's not hurting anybody. Okay, so when he gets to his books, and he makes a comment that I just want to read right here. He had grown callous to the shabby trick played him by dead languages. And then he also makes a comment, or this is Hardy making the comment, the mountain weight of material under which the ideas lay in those dusty volumes called classics piqued him into a dogged, mouse-like subtlety of attempt to move it at piecemeal, which means that's piecemeal. It's going very slowly. However, he does start to catch on, and that's kind of part of the tragedy of it, is that he does all the right things. And you know, you can't apply the American dream, doesn't work for this, but if it were an American novel, then it would be the story, or at least the idea, is that the harder you work, the more you will achieve, and everything's going to be great, which doesn't always happen in American novels too, especially if they are satirizing the American dream. But here you can write about the class distinction, and the haves and the have-nots, and how the orphan is like the burden of society, and his life isn't worth anything, and that's the way he's treated. Okay, so he gets in trouble. They have this cop talk to him about it, and then he brings up another issue that I talked about in the introduction, and that is actually the education itself, what he's reading. And he gets into this forest, and he's inspired to, it reminds him of this allusion to Diana. And then he starts to think, well, wait a minute. I'm reading Greek mythology. That's not Christian. And if he goes to college, he knows that he's going to have to be ordained, right? So he starts to think, well, maybe I'm not reading the right material, which he is. You should always start with Greek. But anyhow, he turns kind of a new leaf in his education, and he decides he better read up on the fathers. And what he means by the fathers is the early theologians. I mean, I'm talking early first theologians who interpreted the scripture, and that is something I want to kind of get into a little bit later, but just the fact that he's reading the fathers suggests that Jude is going back to more of a traditional. There's a struggle in the book that is about the religious struggle of not just the dark night of the soul, although that's definitely there, but also the struggle between a more evangelical approach or going back to the more traditional. See, during this time for Thomas Hardy, the debate, and there's a letter that actually wanted to read just a little bit of it, just so you can hear Hardy's voice on this. There, he's Anglican, and the Oxford movement, which is going on, that was John Newman was a big component of that. Basically said that the church needed to go back to Catholicism. So if you look at the theology of the Anglican Church, it's not actually rooted. It kind of takes some interpretive gymnastics to show that was the case. It's not the case. What is more ancient is the Eastern Orthodox Church, which didn't go through a lot of different changes. The Reformation never touched the Orthodox Church. I did a lot of this studying myself, and I ended up converting to Orthodoxy and actually found it very liberating because it didn't have the Puritan point of view, But anyways, so the religious struggle, Thomas Hardy, in his biography, Ralph Pite wrote, I don't know if I mentioned this, but this is an important thing to remember, that he said that when Darwin's Origin of Species came out, that there were some Christians who actually committed suicide. Okay, so this is no small thing. And one of Hardy's closest friends, Horace Mule, was more of an upper class guy who went to Oxford and then went to Cambridge. Comes from a wonderful Christian home, loves his father, who's like a minister, and they're also preaching, like, kind of spreading more of an evangelical message. And what I liked about Horace Mule is that he even tried to advocate, I think, along with John Stuart Mill, an expansion of education for all classes. Like, for instance, getting classic literature in the hands of other people who don't have access to it. Okay, so this is before we have access to a library, which I think I count my blessings for that all the time, because it's what saved me. And the ironic thing is, so now that people have it, they don't want to read. They would rather just Google something and look it up. Obviously not you, because you're listening to me at this point, but that how most people are. So the problem with Horace Mule was that he was gay. Now imagine being gay in Victorian age. And you are intended basically for the church. And he didn't want to be a hypocrite. He didn't want to disappoint his father. And he eventually committed suicide, I think, because he couldn't be free to be who he is. And that in itself, that experience for Hardy knows this, okay? And Hardy is also, he's not, his family was not as religious. So he's a little bit more open-minded anyways. And yet, this is what's keeping Hardy cynical about religion. It's not that Hardy is an atheist, because he always wanted to stay and did stay in the church. And he read the Bible, and he said that he would listen for that still small voice. But just like most Victorians during this time, he had a lot of doubt. because of the scientific revolution and, you know, things that they were taught by the church about the universe, the world, was wrong, because it was older than what, you know, they had been taught. The universe is more expansive than what they thought. So this causes a lot of problems, which is why it was so difficult for people who are educated to automatically assume that those people are going to all be priests, bishops, and that's another thing I want you to think about with Jude. As he kind of turns this corner and says, okay, I know what I've got to do. I have to read all this other stuff to prepare myself for theology classes. And he fantasizes kind of in a way about being a priest, and then he says, I could be a bishop. And then he says, no, then I'll draw the line at the archdeacon or something like that. And then he thinks about a bishop again. But notice that he's not thinking he wants to be a priest because he has a particular calling to do it. He's thinking of it in terms of profession. That's the profession. So there's a lot of people who have no business being priests, who are becoming priests and maybe bishops. And what is their main interest? Well, probably more with politics and government. So it just kind of makes a mess of things, and Hardy knows this. And I think that's what he's satirizing. It's not something he personally has against God, I don't think. I think it's what man has to do, and man has to do this because this is the way the society is. All right, so getting into chapter 6, now I want to go back to the tragic hero, the tragic flaw. The first thing to understand about it is what exactly does that mean about having a flaw? And I would think of the flaw as like the 7 deadly sins. And I'll tell you why. It's because let's say that you're reading a story, or I'm reading a story with a class, and we say, well, what is this protagonist's problem? And someone says he steals. He steals. Okay. Why does he steal? What makes him steal? And what I try to get to is pretty much the 7 deadly sins. Is it pride? Is it lust? Is it gluttony? You know, what's causing this? And so we get to greed. Okay, so he's greedy. Why is he greedy? And what I eventually want to get to is that, you know, what makes a person, for instance, suffer from gluttony, lust? Why does this person think he deserves other people's things? It's because I deserve it, right? It's because I need it, because I'm more important than him. So is that not a form of pride, if you think about it? So hubris is typically the flaw. It's the one that you go to. But sometimes you make an argument for another flaw just because that's what you want to do with your thesis. Just like with King Lear, I know it's pride, I know it's hubris, I know someone's going to say that's not it, whatever. But if I want to make a point, this is not just a king, this is an old king who is still vain. That's a great approach, right? That's a great analysis. Plus, I don't want to say what everyone else is saying. I don't want to be obvious. Okay, so think about that. You have the sin, or whatever you want to call it, this flaw already kind of inherent. Actually, I heard this from a priest one time, and he was talking about raising children. And if you want to know what their sin, you know, is going to kind of derive from, you can always just look at yourself and then see like where they're probably going to slip up. And I think that's true. So I think it's a kind of, sometimes ego isn't just yourself. Sometimes it's a collective ego too. Like the family is sort of, whatever way the family is. But like I said before, this isn't a bad person. Okay, just because you do something bad does not make you a bad person. What happens is you miss the mark. And the term for that is hamartia, which literally means, I'm losing my place. It literally means like you've aimed, like in archery, you aim and you miss it. This is probably not looking good on video, but it's not like you miss the entire target. You just miss it a little bit. So Aristotle said that it should, when you're with tragedy, it should evoke both pity and fear. Now, I think it's obvious why pity, but it's not as obvious as like fear. So if you analyze the fear, think about where the fear is coming from. Let's say somebody is an alcoholic and they typically go out drinking all the time. Well, at some point, they made a mistake and they killed somebody. And you hear about it. And in one way, you're not really surprised, but in another way, you feel bad, because you feel bad, especially for the family of the person, but you also feel bad that this is going to ruin his life. And you might actually feel, if you've ever been guilty of maybe having a few glasses of wine and getting behind the wheel, even though that's not something you would normally do, of, oh my God, what if that happened to me? See, so, and it's because of that human connection that we can feel fear. A lot of times when you're watching a movie, what a good screenplay does is make sure that even if the protagonist is not a great person, even if you're watching The Hangover, you're still kind of rooting for these guys. You don't want anything too bad to happen to them, because that wouldn't be funny. You wouldn't be able to like go, okay, that was a great film. So that's kind of a collective feeling. And that's the emotion. If you ever want to be a writer, no matter what you decide to write, you have to create that emotion. That a TV show, whatever, people are not going to buy into it unless they like the person. And like I've said before, they don't like boring people. We like interesting people. We like flawed people. It's kind of like, in The Office, and people like Michael Scott. I mean, he's lovable because he's like a Mr. Magoo and is just completely unaware, and then says whatever, and it ends up being somewhat true sometimes, and it's funny. And one of my favorite episodes to teach comedy, and when I teach importance of being earnest, is when he gets in trouble with his boss, and they said, you said something that's inappropriate, and he said, well, it was funny. And they said, but it was inappropriate. And he said, but that's what comedy is. It's supposed to, if it wasn't inappropriate, it wouldn't make us laugh. And usually it's something that is something other people are thinking of, but would never say it. Sometimes it's just the truth. And the truth, some of us have found out the hard way, can be very inappropriate, depending on who you say it to. My cat Oliver, by the way, is going crazy right now because he gets fed like twice a day, and it's always chicken or turkey, and he's spoiled. But I call him Oliver, and I bring this up because I named him after Oliver Twist. And one of the most iconic moments. And if you haven't read Oliver Twist, doesn't matter, you'll know because of the film. What this is when Oliver goes back for seconds and says, "More, please." And everyone goes, "He wants more?" And it's just the audacity of this kid, this orphan, asking for more in life. And see, that really is, epitomizes all of this as well, in why people are hostile to Jude. So Jude really hasn't done anything wrong yet. But once you get to chapter 6, he meets Arabella. And the first thing that she does is throw a piece of pig flesh at him. This is very important symbolism, right? Because when he sees her, he's very physically attracted to her. It's kind of a flesh desire. Later on, he's going to call his desire this animal desire. And the first thing is, okay, so she throws that at him, but the other impression you get from Arabella is that she lies to him. Like, one of the very first things she says, "It wasn't me. I wouldn't have done that." And she knows she did, but she has no shame whatsoever when it comes to telling the truth. And I'll talk more about her character and why that is for her case. She's not a bad character. She is kind of a bad girl in a way, but you also have to kind of feel sympathy for her too, when you see where is she coming from in all of this. And so what you start to see with Jude is what any normal high school boy would do, who had his best intentions of studying all day on Sunday. Now he has a date. And so I think I'll just leave it at that, because I've done a lot to kind of build the context around what we're about to see. And things are going to start getting interesting. All right, so stick with it. Thanks.